Thank you so very much, Daniel, for giving us the opportunity to talk to you. The day for the Sign Languages International Day is coming up, so we thought we would have a conversation. Let me just briefly introduce Daniel. Daniel Marc is Canadian, living in Pakistan for a long time, co-founder of DeafReach, has been working in the development sector for quite a few years. Then, if I may start by asking, um, then what is the state of sort of summarizing what the state of the right now the condition is, how many children are there in Pakistan who might be hard of hearing or might be deaf, and what sort of schooling and other opportunities are available to them?
Okay, well, thank you very much first, Mr. Bari, and ideas for including DeafReach into your research and giving us an opportunity to explain what's happening, current condition of the deaf community, some of the setbacks and the progress. Um, so it's hard to come by hard statistics, but they say there's about 1 million deaf children in Pakistan who don't have access to education. There is about 5% of the population has some form of hearing loss, and that comes at different degrees, different levels. Um, so for for a deaf person to have access to education in its own language, native language, which is sign language, is very difficult. You may have some government or private institutes in the larger cities, Karachi, Hyderabad, Karachi, Lahore, Islamabad, and the government has some institution in different cities. But then the lack of resources in the native language of the deaf, which is sign language, is not available, or trained teachers also, um, and using modern technology. So it's very challenging. One and two is the majority of the population of Pakistan live in rural areas, so there is no school for the deaf in the rural areas. So unless you live in a city where you have access to a school, private or government, uh, where the teachers are trained and where there are resources, then the quality of education really suffers.
And then, so I want to explore this bit about sign language because uh, for a deaf child who might not, who's not hearing from birth, the the initial, for all children, the initial learning tends to be auditory,
Right.
right? Interacting with the mother or caregiver who might say, I love you and this, and all those conceptual development and language is auditory learning. So when a child who's deaf doesn't get that and is not exposed to sign language, which is their first language, how does that manifest in terms of impacts on the child?
Uh, well, as you just mentioned, if you learn to speak by what you heard, and 90% of deaf children actually live in hearing families. So they live in a complete isolation. And uh, the biggest problem is not that they're deaf. The biggest problem is that there's a language deprivation. They don't have access to a form of communication. So then affects all the areas of your life, emotional, cognitive, learning abilities, and so on and so forth. So that hinders their mental growth, their emotional growth, their learning growth. But again, once a deaf child has access to a form of education in its native language, which is sign language, then they will learn and they'll pick up. So students who come to us at various ages who have had no access to language and they go through a basic vocabulary, intense vocabulary building, and that can take 6 months to a year. The same way we are teaching our hearing children to speak, right? A toddler, it takes 2 years, 2.5 years to be able for him to learn the few basic words that we like to hear. Aba, baba, mama, right? So it's the same thing with a deaf child. But once he understands what a sign means, then learning starts.
So, which brings me to saying that a lot of parents take a long time, whether it's lack of information, whether it's lack of access to resources. But sometimes in our research also we find a lot of parents take quite a bit of time before they reach institutions where a child can be exposed to sign language.
That's correct.
But from what you've told me, now it seems that one of the first things to do if there is a child who can't hear in the family is to start exposing them to sign language.
Yeah, at the earliest. Actually, even uh, DeafReach is trying to encourage the government to enact some of the laws that have been made of screening at birth for any form of disability. So if your parent, as a parent, you know that your baby is deaf from birth, then you will take whatever time it needed, but you will be researching for a form of learning the language. Um, but you have to remember also there's a bigger challenge in Pakistan. The majority of the people live in rural areas. So in rural areas, the parents don't have the resources, the time, the finances to be able to go out and just focus on that one particular child, especially if they have a larger family. So, but once the parents do, as most parents are very, very deeply concerned, they want to do something, they just don't know how or where. So this is where guidance is needed. Thanks to modern technology now, many people can have access to the internet, can have access to information, and they can eventually find out. But yes, the earlier the child is brought into the sign language world, then the better it is for him and his family or her family.
So, having talked a little bit about the state where we are and the issues, now tell us a little bit about DeafReach. What does DeafReach do? What's the scale of work? What was the motivation for DeafReach?
Okay. So Deaf Reach was started by Mr. Richard Geary, who's an American, whose first son became deaf through acute meningitis as a toddler. There are two forms of deafness. One is acquired deafness through different sicknesses or difficulties, and the other one is genetic. So his life, and you can find his interview online, from a tragedy to now what is called a triumph, um, took a real setback. Again, it was in the 70s where you didn't have easy access to different information. And I met Richard here in Pakistan, and together we founded the Deaf Reach program, which started very, very humbly for basically a literacy program for deaf adults. And then later technology came, so we were the first, one of the first school for the deaf with it, um, using computers, using technology, and it was a very humble beginning in Sadar, in a small room, and again, it was just for a basic literacy program for deaf adults to prepare them for the job market. And then some parents heard about it and start bringing their smaller children from Baldia town. Uh, and then the program just grew to where now we have 8 schools with 1,500 deaf children coming from a 50-kilometer radius of our schools, which are located in Karachi, Sujawal, Hyderabad, near Tondwalayar, Nawabshah, Sakar, Lahore, and Tehran. And we teach from KG to college. We have a BA program, and now we're working with the Karachi University to be able to go do a master. So we provide the pick and drop, 50-kilometer radius of the schools. So that's one of the biggest challenges, to have access, one, to an educational facilities, two, and to have access in your own language. So these two big challenges. So what we have done is we remove these obstacles for providing the pick and drop, then the lunch, the uniform, the books, so that the children can just focus on education and their family are not financially burdened, because it's a pay as you can afford program, and the rest is the schools are run on donations from 80% from the Pakistan community here and 20% from the overseas Pakistanis in Canada, UK, US, and elsewhere. So I think besides the school program, I think one of the biggest achievements at the moment, and it's a work in progress, is the documenting and the developing of the Pakistan Sign Language digital learning resources. which is now available on a website with a visual dictionary of 6,000 signs, 1,000 videos for teachers, for students to learn, to get instruction. There's even animated stories in sign language for deaf children, because everybody loves stories. Kids love stories, but then no one is there to tell stories to deaf kids, right? So we created some of those, and this was disseminated across the country via DVDs, via books, via now the internet, via learning devices that were distributed across the country. And now it's a work in progress.
If I were to ask you, how can society help deaf reach? Are there things we can do that will help deaf reach?
Yes, well, thank you. That's a very good question. And I think creating awareness that deaf can do anything except hear, that they have their own language. They can do anything, as you have seen yourself while visiting the Lahore campus, that 50% of our teaching staff is deaf. The principal is deaf. And that's the same across all our campuses. Wherever a deaf person have had access to education from a child in other countries, they become lawyers, they become directors of companies, they become dentists. They can access all the professions that is the same for a hearing person. So creating awareness that uh, deafness is not a disability, but it's just simply a minority group with a different language. We would be very much at disadvantage or disabled if we were to go to China tonight for dinner and order our read the Chinese menu, and so we would face some similar challenges. So creating awareness that deaf people can do everything, they can learn, they can become good employees, they can contribute to and become very contributing member to society. I think that's one of the awareness. And there's they come and visit some of our campuses in the cities that I've mentioned and support deaf education in whatever way you can.
And then, in the same vein, if you were thinking of the broader issues that we talked about a little earlier, so three sets of people. What can parents do if they have a child who's deaf? What can the community do to help or to create a different environment? And what can the government, what would you ask the government to do right now if in terms of the next few steps?
Hmm. I think parents, we've already discussed that try to find uh, education facility where children can learn their own native language, which is sign language. Have their parents learn sign language. Actually, I mentioned the parents in all of our deaf school have to come once a month, one Saturday a month for 2 hours to learn the basic sign language. So when the child goes back home, he's no longer living in isolation. That he also can communicate with some of his siblings or his parents. Um, we talked about the parents doing an early screening, and the community at large again is to create awareness about that community, remove the stigma of disability, employ deaf adults. This is very successful also in Deaf Reach. We have over 2,000 deaf adults that we were able to find employment in different industries. KFC being one of the leading one that has really made a major contribution to society, and that is to employ deaf people, but also put them in where the hearing world has to interact with the deaf person. And that's really proving to be a very big success story, not only for Pakistan, but even around the world. It's a very unique story. The employment for deaf people and the government, actually, I would say the Pakistan is very progressive in that each provinces do have disability act. So then it remains to the private sector, the NGOs, to leverage whatever is already in place, to recognize, which is another something we're working on, to recognize sign language as another national language, as an official language of the deaf, and to continue to provide their facilities, their laws, their infrastructure for deaf education.
And thank you so very much for joining us today, for giving us the opportunity. It's a pleasure and honor to be here at Deaf Reach. And Serhab, thank you so very much for creating another interpretive and language for people to understand this podcast. Kind of.
Thank you very much.